Good evening, everybody. It is 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on a Wednesday evening, April 26th. My name is Max Cohen. I'm the lead writer for the Museum of Crypto Art. This is the Mocha Live podcast. Joining me as he does every week from the Museum of Crypto Art, the founder of the museum, Colborne Bell. Colborne, what's up?
Chilling. Good to be here.
And joining us, as he does not every week, the metaverse architect of the museum, the metaverse architect we all need in our lives, Untitled XYZ. What's up, dude?
Hey, guys. It's an honor to be here. Grateful to be here. Looking forward to chatting.
We're very excited to have you here. We wanted to have you here because you've been active on a number of blockchains throughout your long and storied crypto art history. And the topic on our minds today is blockchains, but like different blockchains. I think that we all, I know for myself, I tend to have like a bit of tunnel vision when I think about crypto art. I think about it as a product of Ethereum. I think Ethereum first, Ethereum second, Ethereum third. And that I just am not sure is correct. So we're going to talk about all sorts of different chains: Solana, Polygon, AVAX, Tezos. I mean, there's a bunch. Untitled, I wanted to specifically ask you about a blockchain that I don't think many people think about at all, but you were really active on, which is Steem, or Steemit, right? Steem.
Yes, that's right. Steem, the Steem blockchain, and Steemit was an app that was built on top of it.
Okay, so what was that like? I mean, this is 2016.
Yeah, so that was 2016 when it first kicked off. I think it was July of 2016, or June, maybe technically. But it was a social media network where likes basically equated to currency. So they had a currency called Steem, and basically it was a blogging platform. And instead of like when you like something, you're basically dedicating inflation to like token inflation to users. Yeah. So it was kind of a crazy, as you would expect, crazy popularity contest. It's a pretty rowdy platform.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, just to think that like that was happening around the same time that like the Rare Pepe community was starting on Ethereum. Did you have any like crossover at that time, or were you kind of sequestered on Steemit?
Counterparty. Rare Pepe was counterparty.
Oh, it was not Ethereum.
Bitcoin.
Okay. Oh, awesome. Okay. So can you guys fill me in on the history that I clearly don't know nearly as much about as I should? Cole, were you there when like Rare Pepe started minting, or did you come in like after the fact?
I mean, I was there, but that was not a community that was known to me.
Uh-huh.
And I was, at the time in 2016, I did some Bitcoin meetups and some ETH meetups. Honestly, it was mostly just like small gatherings in New York. And I went to a handful, but like pretty quickly, I got very deep into the Steem scene. And it was very, like, a big term back then was like tribalism. Everyone is, and it's still valid today, but everyone is very into their own chains and kind of defensive of them. Which happens still today. So I was very much kind of into the Steem scene. And since it was a social network by nature, there were a lot of meetups, a lot of kind of gatherings and stuff like that.
Colborne, when you were like first kind of delving into like collecting crypto art, I know that you had some familiarity with what was happening with the Pepes on Bitcoin, but you were mostly on Ethereum. Did you find that tribalism in the chains back then as well?
I mean, my experience collecting crypto art in 2017 was on an app called Additional, which was effectively like an Instagram clone in which they kind of paid all the gas fees for people to like mint and collect. So, I have this pretty like cool collection that I did just this year find the seed phrase of 250 additional artworks that are of varying quality. So I was predominantly on ETH at the time, and I was doing more investment activity. I remember stuff like the Mecenas art token that was launched. I remember when Codex was launched. You know, and obviously CryptoKitties was huge in 2017. I was like an original adopter of Mooncats then, so it wasn't I saw the use case for art at that time, especially around like provenance and authenticity. But it wasn't really till it did like a full cycle that I kind of came back around and got super into it.
Yeah. You know, I famously got my start on Solana, right? And I kind of like meandered over to like NFTs on ETH after pretty significant exposure to mostly PFPs on Solana. And it's interesting to see how those two ecosystems have developed just since I've been a part of them. Obviously, the crypto art scene on Ethereum is so much like stronger, or at least has like longer, much older bones, right? You know, it's been pumping. At least the artistry has since 2017 or so. Whereas I believe the first NFTs minted at all in Solana were August of 2021. But it's interesting to see a kind of nation art market develop there, and they have different like idols more or less. They have a kind of different aesthetic, and I think that's a really interesting place to kind of kick off a more conceptual question, which is, you know, will chains, or do they already, like develop individual aesthetics? My argument initially is yes, right? And the reason I say so is because I think about like Tezos, right, where FX hash is hugely influential, right? And I think you see a greater proportion of generative art on Tezos than you do on Ethereum, where it's more of a niche rather than something approaching like a majority or a huge amount. Whereas on Solana, when I look at the art, while there is the generative art, the artists who have, I think, the highest kind of like cultural capital are people like John Lay or Ben Bashau, who are like almost like comic artists, or very comic inspired. And a lot of the art that does really well there is a lot more nostalgic. It's a lot less like fine art influence. It's a lot more clearly of this millennial. Kirk, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting observation, because I think like with Steam in the early days, because it was commingled as a kind of a blogging platform, what people would do to get the most likes is basically write about the process of creating their art. So they would be forced to, they wouldn't be able to. In fact, they might be even punished for creating a post with just an image, and it would be downvoted and their reputation would go down. So what happened on Steemit was people, and these are early people like, Stella Bell was a big Steemit user, Ophelia Fu, Eric Vance Walton was a big time writer back then. And Fairy Tale Life for me was very influential because she was the first person I actually like connected with. And she said, like, write about your work, like explain how you created that image. So people would create these, really beautiful kind of like tutorials almost on what they did. And it was a way for art to exist there because it just would be punished otherwise, basically.
Yeah. Sorry, Cole, what were you gonna say?
Well, I mean, it's so interesting how like the identity of the chains is carried like culturally into the output that is produced, right? So I kind of think of like Bitcoin as, Bitcoin is like the honey badger, it doesn't give a fuck, right? So that was like really, I think, influential for like the rare Pepe community, because that messaging is like really the same, right? This is like an iconic symbol that can be adopted, like utilized in different ways, but it's always that thing of just like rebelliousness, not caring, like, and that is very core identity. Steemit, if I recall, was a project of Dan Larimer, who was one of the lead programmers on EOS, right? So there was like a lot of overflow of that community in kind of maybe like an Ethereum competitor into maybe something like this. I think, we should also talk about like how Steemit kind of maybe led to Cent, and there's like incredible early writings on Cent as well about like what people were doing in crypto voxels, or explanation of the art there, right? Like I was involved in 2017, or might have been early 2018, in the Tezos ICO, so I got to see kind of like the evolution of that chain from an identity that is like completely different from what it is today. So it's interesting as like these blockchains are born, how they begin to find identity, how they begin to like communicate that to their audience, and the types of people that are attracted to that messaging and create cultural output on top of it.
Colborne, do you think there will always be a kind of split between these blockchains? I mean, you guys both seem to be saying or suggesting that, the era of the 2017, 2018, 2019 was kind of similar in how things were schismed across blockchains, similar to how they are now with, at least a burgeoning, if not thriving NFT scene on 6 or so blockchains at the very least. Do you think that continues, or, I'm kind of under the impression that chain agnosticism is going to be inevitable at some point?
I don't really buy it because like attention spans are short, right? So
Mhm.
even when people were like talking about the projects that they were invested in, like Chainlink was like the Chainlink Marines, and there's like a stoicism about that, and they would kind of like present that. Or you go to like Dogecoin, like one of the original like probably original meme coin. It's like more fun and playful and has like
Mhm.
the iconography of like the dog. Um, so I think it's almost they're just inescapable. And I think like Ethereum, what is like Ethereum? I don't know. I always think of like the buffer corn, like the mix between like buffalo and unicorn for Ethereum, as like early iconography. There was obviously like a lot of like lifting of Vitalik into almost like a Jesus like figure, and a lot of reappropriation of like Renaissance themes. And these are kind of just like classic ways and symbols and things that messages spread.
Mm. And Kirk, what were you gonna say?
I was just going to say Steam, they were steamers. So that obviously didn't take off very well. Different roles. People can never agree.
I think this is a really fascinating point about how each blockchain develops the language of its own ethos. And I think again about my time with Solana, and just like the traits within the PFP collection, and they're all like, you'll have something or other that'll have a Solana skin, right? As opposed to, with the colors, the blue, the turquoise, the purple. And that's kind of just like a recognized symbology of that blockchain, or like the purple of, one of the influencers, Soul Big Brain, has this like purple avatar and everything is purple. So that will trickle into the iconography of like the PFPs itself. And then, that gets picked up by the art in ways that are, either mocking or an homage or ironic. I don't know. I mean, do either of you have insight into what like that iconography looks like on Tezos? My, experience there is a little limited.
I have no experience on Tezos. Yeah, I have, I was there. I saw it. I don't want to like speak to anything, but that it just never connected with me that was a place for art. But I'll say it clearly showed that there was a need for an alternative chain that would like facilitate low fees, that gave more access. And when we begin to talk about like the promises of crypto art as a whole in like increasing artistic sovereignty and giving them more choices, it's very, very evident that we're still like tip of the iceberg in the ways that we can use these technologies to like facilitate distribution and bring on more artists into just general crypto ecosystems.
So one thing, and I just looked this up to make sure, there was a Tezos octopus that was kind of like and I don't know what you would call it, but it was an icon early on because I think it was a diagram of their self-amending protocol. And it's like a super confusing diagram. And if you Google Tezos octopus, it'll show up. But yeah, I don't know. I think, a lot of the imagery is super interesting in all of this, because I do think it really adds to the kind of like culture and virality of a new system or ecosystem. And with art has always been, I mean, these visual kind of ways that people communicate this stuff. Art has been so instrumental across all of these chains, in different mediums or different kind of methods. But I think it's fascinating. I mean, obviously, all these chains, some will survive and some will not. But I and some
Well,
have survived and some have not. But yeah.
well, I think that leads to another interesting point, which is, if you use the infrastructure of, say, MetaMask wallet, we'll just take wallets as the example, right? MetaMask wallet is really professional, almost to the point of it being like difficult to access for people not in the know. It's not it's not an accessible piece of technology. You kind of got to know your way around. Solana wallets, like a Phantom wallet, for instance, is a little bit more, I think, accessible. It's a little bit more polished. It's very sleek, almost like an iPhone. When I use like a Temple wallet on Tezos, it it just doesn't aesthetically feel up to par, right? It's just a bit clunkier, right? It's not to say anything about the back end technology, but just the experience with it. And I think that Coborn, one of the things that you've expressed otherwise is like, well, there's just less built on Tezos. We know less about its ability to sustain itself in the long term, right? And what happens when a chain like Tezos falls apart, right? Like what would that look like? And so I'm curious, what do you think? If say Tezos were to fall apart, what happens to those artists? What happens to those ecosystem? And maybe that has happened before in another example. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, without, I'm just individually curious if like art and culture is a sufficient use case and need for a blockchain to exist, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think if there are not like other native users participating in different things, like at the heart of this is really a financial revolution in building parallel architecture there. So if you don't have those use cases, is there an enduring long-term case for these assets, these cultural assets that are being created there? And if you bring in culture first, is that enough to kind of fill in the other sides?
Yeah.
I don't have that answer, and I'm excited to see kind of what that means. I think NFTs for sure are here to stay. I don't believe there is like a Tezos bridge for assets there to move over to other chains. I think there is probably a reason why, and I don't know if this is entirely true, but I don't think OpenSea supports the trading of Tezos assets.
Well, I mean, I think I'm using Tezos more as like a stand-in conceptually. So think about like, I've explored at times like Luna NFTs or like near NFTs, and those blockchains are either defunct or at much less capacity and interest than they were at other points. I suppose, Kirk, maybe you can shed some insight on this, but like, let's say just for the sake of argument, a blockchain like Tezos, right, that just has a huge artistic ecosystem, let's say it kind of falls apart. Do you think people migrate to other chains? Do you think they do so to one place en masse? Do you think they port the ideology of, say, our Tezos, or do you think they're kind of glomming onto the individual cultures of other chains?
That's interesting. I think, well, we haven't in this cycle really seen, or maybe we have, but we haven't, in my eyes, seen a like full-on blockchain collapse in the same way that we did in the previous cycle. Like Steam, famously, the Defiant has an amazing article about it, but Steam collapsed when Justin Sun tried to acquire an entire blockchain, and a community actually fractured off and created, well, it split in a lot of ways. There is still Steam, but it is a shadow of its former self. And then there's Hive, which actually was created out of the community, a core community that wanted freedom. And that is actually an incredible story, like really unbelievable kind of sequence of events. But
Can you tell it?
I can tell parts of it. Like it started with like Steemit Inc. was the company behind the Steam blockchain. They launched the blockchain, and Ninja Mind, it was called, like 80% of the token supply. And so they had a massive control over the token, and it eventually kind of dwindled down as they sold it off over the years down to like 30%. But ultimately, Steemit Inc. Was purchased for several $1,000,000 by Justin Sun. And Justin Sun then essentially acquired this stake. The community of users at that time were really upset about that because it was done kind of without any engagement and without any, it was kind of shadowy how it was done. And to that point, people are like, are you acquiring the app steemit.com, or are you acquiring the blockchain? Like, what is the intention here? So I'll try to go through it super quickly without rambling, but Justin Sun, his intention was to fold it into Tron. That was his intention. He wanted a popular app. He wanted to buy it, fold in the usership into Tron. And what happened was the community got really upset. They didn't like that. They actually, the block producers who were part of Steemit issued a hard fork or a soft fork maybe, and froze Justin Sun's so that he couldn't transfer it. And as a response, Justin Sun called all of his exchange buddies at Huobi and Binance and had them give him stake that he could use to then have another hard fork and cut all of those down. So it became like this battle of hard forks, and all these block producers were like flying back and forth in terms of who they were. And it was fascinating because in the end, Justin Sun basically like froze or deleted accounts that were part of this blockchain. So people lost millions of dollars. And they did it with funds from Binance, which were also user funds. It was crazy. It was like
see, now you understand why we say this is the chain wars. This is not like hunky dory, like warmth of other chains.
Yeah, my original title was The Warmth of Other Chains, and Colborn in his publicity for it changes it to The Chain Wars.
Oh no, it was just blood in the street. It was crazy. And honestly, it was minute to minute crazy. And people just like the price skyrocketed because people were buying to like fight one another. And a lot of people lost a lot of money. And ultimately the community decided to break off and create Hive. I wasn't as engaged in that ecosystem. That was like early 2020 when that happened. But it's an incredible story. And of that, just back to your initial question, there are very few people that kind of bounced into the Ethereum ecosystem cleanly from that. I don't think I did cleanly. I was pretty traumatized by all this stuff. And it took me a while to kind of like really sort of get back in a rhythm. But there are like, honestly, one of the artists he's not in this piece, but Shortcut, who I didn't mention earlier, is one of the few artists who actually like saw the right, moves to make and got into the Ethereum ecosystem very well. And Ophelia Fu, I think, did that as well. And Stella Bell, they're a number, but I think it was challenging for a lot of those artists to gain trust again through those wars. It was a lot of traumatic conflict. And I think when we're talking about the history of crypto art, I've mentioned this to our team and we've talked about it, but a lot of the people from the earlier chains, it just like falls away and they don't get mentioned as part of the conversation when we're talking about history of digital art, history of crypto art. I think that's an important topic too.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that goes back to what we were kind of hinting at before, which is like, it's really easy to get caught in the tunnel vision of individual chains. I know on Solana, outside of like certain events that kind of bring people back and forth, and I can think specifically of like Patrick Amadon did a Solana release, and so did Kath Samard, and that's, I think, more on the positive side. Then you have the little more dubious side, which is like Solana PFP projects like DGods bridging over to Ethereum, or Utes bridging over to Polygon. And suddenly you kind of have, it's like these wormholes opening up between the chains. And suddenly you're able to like see through, and you see some of the figures on the other side, and some of the ethos on the other side, and some of the, I don't know, like the iconography on the other side. And it really is kind of amazing how fractured so much of this ecosystem continues to be across blockchains. Colborn, do you think that most collectors have settled on a chain like permanently, or do you think that like there will eventually be, I don't know, like cross-chain collectors, cross-chain collectorship being kind of the standard as opposed to the outlier?
Okay, I'm gonna say two things, and I'm gonna start with the artists, right? I think the artists are incredibly compelled where there is new space to fill it, right? And I think
Yeah.
Ethereum as a chain right now feels incredibly saturated, and it's just not so interesting. As a collector, I'm not so interested. I'm not seeing like so many new things, so much new innovation. So like as a collector, I'm keen to follow the artists, right? So I saw a lot of artists like when Ordinals was launched, move there and start to inscribe stuff there. And I think that is exciting for everybody.
Mhm.
Now, like there is a time to be collecting, and there is also a time to be like building, right? And I think we've already proven that like NFTs as a concept are here to stay. But
Mhm.
my initial like imperative to be in this was to go to like the fringe of creativity. So I know a lot of artists are like very unsure of where to mint right now. Ethereum has this like place of prestige where like fine art is, and where sales are like higher sales are meant to be happening, but no sales are happening right now.
Mm.
So how as an artist do you get to like return to where it is fun, where you can freely like express and create, where you don't have to kind of like worry about floor prices? And this is always kind of like a constantly shifting thing that everybody has to kind of like philosophically align with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It reminds me of like talking to Curran 4D months ago and asking him about how, because he shares so much art on Twitter, right? But he only mints very sporadic pieces. And it's kind of an artificial decision, right? Just based on like his own feeling, right? But there's a legitimacy that he feels from minting that isn't based in just sharing artwork, right? I sometimes see the sentiment among artists on my timeline, which is like this should be fun, right? So release artwork in the world. You don't have to sell everything that you show to the world, right? But there's, I think, this kind of like, just as we're talking about with Ethereum, having this kind of like artificial but still present, sense of prestige that if you're going to mint a work on Ethereum, it has to be polished, it has to be perfect. It's somehow in like this echelon away from, I don't know. I know a lot of artists who will mint more kind of free flowy, less serious, maybe more um, like in progress work on Tezos, just because of there's this feeling that they have a little bit more freedom to do there when that freedom is, I mean, mostly like imagined, untitled. As like from the artist perspective, like what do you think about that?
I mean, generally, like, I think there's some absolutely beautiful artwork and interesting artwork on Tezos.
No doubt.
It's like, and I think it's played a significant role in the health of Ethereum, honestly, because it has that relationship of like, there's a testing ground, and I don't want to diminish it to just a testing ground, but it has been a playground for a lot of people to learn about blockchain and learn about these different rules and these different kind of strategies, what have you. And then, you obviously do see a lot of people like exploring ideas in Tezos and then maybe initiating them or polishing them or what have you on Ethereum. I mean, I don't think that's a bad relationship. And I think there are also obviously artists who do exclusive work on Tezos, and it's all brilliant. I think as an artist, I've found for people who I've spoken with, Ethereum is far too expensive to experiment on.
Yeah.
And Tezos is a really wonderful and welcoming kind of environment for people to explore.
Hmm.
So I think it's been a super attractive for that. I haven't personally minted there. I have bought a few pieces on there, but not a lot. But generally, I think it is. I think it's okay to explore and experiment across different chains. I don't. But yeah, I don't know. Tezos for me as an artist hasn't been. I don't know if it's timing or trust issues or whatever. But I haven't minted on there myself.
Mm. And Coburn, I know you're reticent to buy from other chains, but like I'm curious, like what do you think would theoretically attract you about an art movement on a different chain? What are you looking for? I know you say I know it's very conceptual, right? You're
Like
talking about like following the
I
creativity.
am right. I'm not like a Ethereum maxi, but I am at this point kind of like an EVM maxi, right? Like I want the ability to bring that asset, if I so choose, to the Ethereum blockchain, right?
Hmm.
I generally believe that like Bitcoin has proven itself and Ethereum have proven itself, and they will be here to stay, right? So
Hmm.
when I begin to think about like the durability of that asset for the long term in like a collection that I care about and want to preserve and keep, and these are things that are important to me, right? Like fundamentally, the underlying tech is, and the survivability of that tech is really, really important. So, you know, I've done stuff on Polygon. I've done a lot of stuff on Polygon. Like was big into Avogachis, but this is like, for me, it just cemented itself as a gaming identity, right? More mass assets, more accessible things. And then, you know, it kind of had the unfortunate thing, because gas fees were so low, of just like being a lot of spam. And, you know, so that idea of like being an EVM maxi and being concerned about like the durability and where these assets are created and where these assets go is really important.
Sure.
And the other thing I like wanted to touch on also was that, you know, each of these things again is opening up more space. And I think what, like when Rarible was created, right, this was suddenly outside of the ecosystem where artists could go to mint different types of works that they had never experimented with, right? I think everybody wants these circular feedback loops. I don't think like artists really want to exist like with their work by themselves and then go and be like the advocates for that work in a primary market. You want the back and forth. You want both like the social interaction, but you also want to be putting these assets into people's hands that like really appreciate and care for them. So yeah, I just think like Rarible was like an incredible precursor in beginning to open up space for like more experimental, different works, people to explore different identities that they could then kind of like move back in and forward from, because the costs like at the time to mint on it, it was like $2 to mint on Ethereum. And then during like the last bull market, what was it? It was like $50, $100 to mint something. It's just not accessible, and it's not a great place for people to initiate those feedback loops.
So I think it's just an interesting point, especially about, you know, wanting things connected to Ethereum because of your belief in its stability. You know, I was talking to Sats Moon yesterday, the collector, and he was talking about having a large collection of physical artwork that he had collected over 20 years, you know, like Banksy's and Space Invaders, and it all burned in a storage locker fire, right? Which is how he eventually found his way to the blockchain and became, you know, an uber prominent collector here. And, you know, I feel that sentiment, Coborn, that you made about having kind of a trust in Bitcoin and Ethereum that isn't elsewhere is I feel like that's echoed in a lot of spaces. On a semi-related note, there was a lot of pushback from like the Solana community when DeGods announced that they were bridging to a different chain, right? Not just because they were abandoning the chain, but because it was obviously trying to appeal to a different audience. It just had certain connotations. And I don't think we've really seen that with artwork. But say somebody were to, and I don't know how this works technologically. I'm not sure how easy it is to bridge, you know, any kind of asset, but you know, I think we're going to start seeing at some point, if it's not happening already, bridging of artworks across the chains in which they were made and in which they were minted and into the ecosystems in which they were minted, right? If I'm an artist and I'm creating an artwork just on Solana for the sake of argument, right, and it's referential to Solana, it's important to me that it's on Solana, and then it's bought and it's moved to Ethereum, I'm wondering if you guys think that's unethical. Kirk, I mean, what do you think? If somebody took a sculpture you made or an architecture and moved it to a chain that you either didn't support or didn't feel trust in, how would you feel about that?
I don't think it makes any sense personally, because I think I mean, it depends on the asset. For me as an artist, the point of blockchain is provenance. The point is to have the timestamp and the locality of it somewhere where you can point, and it's like it's there. And if you confuse that by mirroring it or copying it to another chain and minting it there, like I see some artists doing this, and I don't get it, because I think
I just real slight pushback. I agree with you in the long term, but I think in the short term, the provenance is almost culturally recognized. Like we all know that Cosimo de Medici owns X copies right click save as guy, right? We don't need to look at the provenance of any artwork because it's culturally understood that that's where that artwork is. Now, whether that changes in the future, whether that's as, you know, cut and dry as it seems, nevertheless, I think, and I'm curious for your take on this as well, but I think a lot of people, if there's a a desire to bridge across chains, it's because it is known that they own a certain artwork and they are trying to communicate something about their affiliation with the chains based on changing that artwork. So the actual provenance doesn't matter because, Lady X owns art Y from artist Z, and we all know that. So the bridging, it doesn't change anything about the provenance because we are all aware of how that artwork moved.
Let's take a different example that I think is just infinitely stupid, that is relatable. is like all the people that came in and like did the live physical burnings of like the Banksy works and put them on the blockchain, and they're like, okay, like now this is an NFT, like we made the first Banksy NFT. That is like it's infinitely stupid because the artist had no intent to ever create that work in that capacity, right?
Yeah.
So I kind of think of those things as the same. Like you are literally burning the artistic intent and you are like recreating something that is like of your own doing. And I think that's dumb.
It's like, I mean, it's no longer Banksy, obviously. It's like a performance piece by a collector, and it's a terrible performance. But like I think I personally, and I know every artist has their own kind of intent and focus on this, and I respect any of that. I think for me personally, when I sell a piece, honestly, I am giving a lot of authority to the collector, and I respect their decisions. If they decide to do something I don't agree with, I kind of respect that because it's part of the legacy of it's what you're doing when you sell a piece on a blockchain. You're selling a token to a person, and they're the steward of that token. They can make decisions about it, however stupid or brilliant. In my eyes, I think there's always artist intent, and in my eyes, I think that always has to be a part of the story. But I don't know. I think it's tricky. It always comes down to context, I feel like, in terms of what's going on, why are they making this decision, and what are they factoring in. And I think I don't know, provenance is so important, and I feel like that original timestamp is just like the meaning of that token.
But this is also, I think, to a certain extent, locked in a very current perspective, right? As we must be, but technology will advance, right? And like already, like the museum itself uses infrastructure that moves between Ethereum and Polygon blockchains, right? That's only going to proliferate. It's only going to get easier. The tools by which these blockchains are interconnected, the various wormholes connected, blockchain A and blockchain B, are only going to get stronger. And I'm curious, like, I imagine at a certain point, I don't know how far out we are from it, but moving across blockchains is just going to become a lot more normal than it is today, right? A lot cheaper and a lot easier too. You'll be able to move things back and forth across, say, Polygon and Ethereum, as easily as an artist tells you they don't want their piece moved to Polygon. So, just move it back, and it's cheap and it's easy. I'm wondering, Colborne, like, do you think when that happens, or and again, maybe you have better insight about how far away we are from that happening, but do you think that will change, like, your opinion on, this kind of like artist intention aspect?
Something just like came to mind, and I think maybe it's worth you exploring in a different thing. But Robness took a CryptoPunk, burned the CryptoPunk, and then minted like 10,000 editions of this burnt CryptoPunk on Tezos, right? And that was clearly, I don't want to say clearly, but I viewed that as a piece of performance art. And shout out Colin, who's been like a super dear friend. He used Emblem Vault to wrap that object asset and send it to the museum on Ethereum. So, I don't, what do we have? It also, like, within the museum, we have a very interesting piece of like history, but I also think it's like, is that a piece of that burnt CryptoPunk? Beyond the performance. Like, I also think there was like an incredible stupidity around people that were trying to like fractionalize digitally physical artworks and say that like you owned, like this pixel of this Banksy.
Yeah.
So
Well, I think this is a, yeah, sorry, no, finish up.
Like just like the financialization of the art is not, it removes it's so far away from like the art itself that it renders it almost kind of like meaningless.
Well, it's all narrative, right? It all comes back to the narratives that we tell and the narratives we preserve, right? Because that piece that Colin donated, the wrapped object piece, that might be understood as a quote unquote fragment of that burnt punk if the history of that asset is communicated effectively in the future, right? If it's not, then it just becomes another thing. It's outside the purview of the artwork itself, right? I think about the royalty debate that we had to fucking go through over the last bunch of months, and how infrequently Dada was mentioned in that discussion, right? And I feel often that Dada's contribution to crypto art is overlooked all the time, despite them being around, preceding CryptoPunks and around the same time as CryptoPunks and Pepe's, and with this incredible contribution. And yet, for whatever reason, I don't think it's always conscious. I think sometimes it's conscious, sometimes it's unconscious, sometimes it's circumstantial. Various narratives are forgotten, and it just inflects the entire history of the thing. Like Kirk, with what you were saying with Steam at Hive, like I've never heard that story before. That now paints the entire history of the blockchain in a different light and paints this entire conversation in a different light. So, and again, I think this relates back to what happens when chain mobility becomes easier and more frequent and less momentous, right? It's harder to make a dent into the narrative, harder to understand or communicate the narrative because it's not as obvious to communicate.
Yeah, Dada I made a Steam account for Dada back in the day, long ages ago. And I think Judy and Bea were both like, this is kind of weird, man. Like, I don't know. I don't get these incentives. And they were totally right. They've been right for a long time. And honestly, they were instrumental for me really trusting a new ecosystem to dive into. They were one of the core relationships I've had early on, and like their app was so holistically, thoughtfully created in a way to like embrace art. Anyway, I could speak for ages on Dada, but they also, like, I think have seen now like a lot of the mistakes that are being made in the market now to kind of like detract from creative integrity and all these different things, and falling into the same market dynamics that ultimately did Steam bad. I feel like, I don't know, we're in this weird kind of like mirroring cycles thing, and I feel like there are going to be other chains that sort of get wrapped up into it. Anyway, I forgot what was your core question. I kind of went down a spiral.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's, yeah. Go on, what's up?
I don't really know what the question is either, but I think there's still mechanisms that we haven't like explored. And on the royalty issue, I think the smartest thing that Matt and John of Larva Labs ever did was to hold back 1,000 of those punks for their own supply, right? So perhaps like, and this is something like building on the side, but if artists are making edition works, right, and royalties are not a promised thing, well, how do we ensure that they are able to keep like pieces of their work, right? And this is something that Xcopy also had to reconcile with lately, where he had said from the very beginning he was only going to mint like 149 one of ones on super rare, but like you come to the realization that, oh my god, like you don't own any of your work, right? And what does that mean? Like you might not be able to get secondary sales in perpetuity, so there has to be kind of like some alternative to, and this is always why I tell artists to like just keep minting, like even if you own it, that's a good thing, right? Because you're just betting on yourself in that regard.
Yeah.
What do you guys think about, maybe you've discussed this in another podcast, but back when art wasn't selling, artists were burning it, and I always was like, no. But I don't know.
Well, I mean, just conceptually that has interesting connotations. As a man with way too many novels and short stories and film scripts never to be seen by the world, just taking up space on a hard drive, it does kind of make me sad to think that if those things were to go out in the world and not be interested in the moment, that they would then be, worthless enough to burn. And I'm not saying that's the situation every time that happens, but I've sent a lot of short stories to the New Yorker and a lot of short stories to the Atlantic, and they've got back to me exactly 0 fucking times. And I don't know if that affects the value of the work itself, right? If the goal of that artwork was to be published in, this big magazine and, finally begin my journey to international novelistic acclaim, then it definitely failed in that regard and it has no value in that arena. But it still feels valuable because it's work that I have now. I think that's different. Like, it's not blurred out of existence. It's just blurred off the blockchain. I think you could make the argument that work minted on the blockchain is designed to sell as its prime, capacity.
I would disagree with that because the primary, it's distribution before the market, right? We're playing with distribution systems that have never existed before, right? And we're playing in a pond that is like a couple droplets of water. We have the ability to grow this into like a lake and an ocean, right? And you look at some of the biggest names like in the space today, a lot of them started by giving away their stuff for free. Right. And I tried to like explain this to people, but a lot of people came in with a like purely market context of like, this is the place to sell your work because that's how media like pick this apart. But like, you look at what the trash artists at large did in the beginning, and they were selling for like $1, right? Like Xcopy was selling his first stuff for like $5. Just get it out there, get it into people's hands, have them like co-invested alongside of you. Right. And it's just a good thing, like the obsession of maintaining floors has ruined so many artists. It has like gotten them to a place where they do not feel comfortable. They're constantly marketing, right? Those messages are falling on deaf ears. And like, also like once you kind of like blast off or have a hype moment, like how do you maintain that when the pond is this big, right? Who is like theoretically going to pay more than $10,000 in this market for works? It is a tiny amount of people, right?
Well, and maybe people on other chains who don't have the opportunity to own your work before. Like that's again, like you said, I mean, that was kind of half a joke, but also, right, it is this little pond, but you also have these other slightly interconnected little ponds without great channels between them, but they're nevertheless aware of one another, right? Like I do think there is something there about like, I don't think we've really seen it explored too much outside of what is basically like experimentation, but like having footprints in different chains.
If you are an artist and you are not taking up and trying to get as much space, you are doing a disservice, I think, to your art, right? I really think this is the stage of distribution, and the people that are able to distribute the broadest and the widest across as many means as necessary are going to be the ones that have people that are invested in them, like for the long tail of their career.
Now, Kirk, you've minted on the oldest blockchain of all, the real world. And by that I mean, how is that? Well, I'm thinking of the Steam it Park project, right, where you like had objects of yours, in real life, right? You had a tangible effect, and I don't know. I mean, I think that there is a sense of relationship to a topic that I've been interested in as well, which is like the interplay between physical and crypto art, right? And like the bridge between those two things, right? One of the things I love about like Pindar Van Arman, and I talk about this all the time, is like the works that are going back and forth across the screen, right? Like the painting, but then the printing, the digitization, like, and then that being put on the blockchain. Like it's very interesting how he plays with these different things.
Yeah, I mean, Pindar has very gracefully, very elegantly been able to straddle the real world art form and the digital art form, and really spoke to both mediums in such a like incredible. I mean, his work, I think, is just extraordinarily unique for that. And I think one of the biggest faults of this movement, or the broader NFT scene, is that we are not really substantially trying to impact physical things in a creative way beyond simply plastering a digital thing on a digital frame and we're done. Like that is the biggest lack of creativity for such an immensely creative space. And I just don't get it. I think it's like a huge missed opportunity, what we're doing with all these gatherings that we do in person, and that's not to all of them, but that's to the broader kind of activity that takes place.
Well, I think this is indicative of a lot of physical art too. I think the difference between having a building that is itself art or having a building with no artistic intent that has a piece of art in the lobby, like that's a huge difference in intent. It's a huge difference in effect, in having the art be sequestered in a specific place as opposed to being the place.
Yeah,
That says a lot.
honestly, I think it's about maturity too. Like, we are in a very young ecosystem here with a lot of artists who are well, they're young for the most part, but they're also like not thinking long term about their craft. And I think this next movement, I hope with this next cycle, I hope we see more experimentation with, like, take your art out into your neighborhood, see what it does. And
Mm.
I hope we start to do that. I know the church has made a significant stride. Like, that's the direction. That's a good direction. And Dada also did that too with a lot of their kind of programming that they did early on. But yeah, I think it's interesting, and maybe that does speak to, like, in terms of maturity, I do see large scale, lots of chains will kind of serve different purposes for different kind of mediums. I hope. But yeah, I think we're at an interesting point now where I think during this kind of downturn in the market, it's very clear how new all of this stuff is and how
Hmm.
like primordial all this is. It's just like super messy and weird.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
We're
am getting
lacking.
I'm getting super worked up over here because it is fucking mind-boggling to me that like it was like the end of 2020 and we were having this incredible renaissance around like 3D assets and like moving into digital spaces, and then we just took a hard right and it was like just JPEGs, just PFP projects, like reducing the vision of where we were going, of like what we were creating in the experimentation, and like knowing that AR is coming and knowing that VR is coming and having ideas of the metaverse, and like reducing it and condensing it back into that like little circle PFP project, and that being the meta for the next 2 years, that like we like missed it, right? Like I think Untitled gets it with the architecture that they're creating, is that like the 3D environment is going to be the place where this art, this digital art that has to be native to digital space, is going to begin to be expressed, right? Because let me tell you, it is interesting to go into VR and to see a video and to look at a JPEG, but it is fucking fascinating to go examine like a sculpture or to go look at the details in the buildings that he does. And I like remember so distinctly when I saw, I think Frenetic Void has only done one 3D asset. The name is Corsair. It was like the most mind-bogglingly beautiful statue that I have ever seen, right? And it was presented when Super Rare did like their first release of 3D assets. How this medium did not take off, I do not know, and this is not relevant to the topic at all. But like when I saw that, I'm like, this is it. This is the thing that is actually going to get people excited. But we're so accustomed to this, like this flat screen, these flat experiences. It's the phone effect. It really is. It's like that Instagram thing, man. We like really need to break out of 2D space into 3D space. We'll be so much better for it. And like you go into these worlds, when I was first going into Somnium, like this is where it gets wild. Like you run into somebody, you have no idea where they're from. They're like like I ran into a snowman once. I'm like, this is like, what are you like? You want to be a snowman? Like that's so wild. That is like where imagination happens, right? It's not in these infinite scroll timelines. It's in these spaces. Like they become like Burning Man-esque in that you do not know like the destination or the journey, but you are attracted to things in the distance, or you run into a certain group of people, and that creates like a whole other connection. This is like so good for our brains to have this sense of like wonder and imagination, and not fall back into these routines.
Yeah, I mean, you even see it with like even just like Twitter itself, or Super Rare itself, or OpenSea itself, right? Like the Web 2 aesthetic is areas of interesting content punctuated by, or like surrounded by, a sea of single gradient color, very segmented areas that maybe make sense in the general UI, but for an artistic ecosystem are far less interesting. And, I see even like various websites, right? When they try and do interesting things, there's only so much you can do in a 2D space that is A, artistic, and B, like traversable in any kind of way that is like doable or portable. Like, yeah, I mean, I think I feel like every conversation we have descends into like, God, we need the metaverse, or like, God, we need AR. But I also think like even in the real life with sculptures and things, right? Even when it's not on a flat surface, it's still like these enclosed areas. We're rarely like living within and without art, right? The sculpture is over there. Maybe it's roped off, or maybe it's, at the center of some kind of a circle in an outdoor area, but it's very clear that that's the art and here's me. And I'm standing in a place where there's no art, looking at the place where there is art. And I think that's more of a conceptual issue that it's harder and harder to overcome. I think like performance art bridges that gap really well in some aspects, even like comedian performance art, like Eric Andre and things like that, where, you're not really sure who's on the stage and who's not on the stage. But I think that's a more holistic problem than it is just a crypto art problem, even though maybe it's overly visible here.
Yeah, we need a please touch the art movement, like to blur those boundaries a little bit differently between the participant and the artist, to what you're saying, but also to get people out of the addiction to squares and rectangles. Yeah. We are designing to an algorithm that is a Web 2 algorithm. It's just the feed. And that is like, there's so much creative power right here in this scene. And people are still just like, oh, but does it fit in this? And it's like,
bro, look at this fucking screen that we're looking at now. There's literally like 40 squares on this screen within this like live stream studio. You go to Twitter and everything's a square. There's 3 squares within a larger square that's segmented into a square and a rectangle. And that's within, there's like, it's just layers and layers of squares within squares within squares.
I blame the Romans. I blame the Romans for all this.
Come on, Kirk. Don't be a
Don't be one of those. Oy.
Oy vey.
Is that a Mean Girls quote?
What? This? It's Pulp Fiction.
Or Legally Blonde? All right, Pulp Fiction. I think it's in Legally Blonde too.
Well, as my grandfather said to me earlier today, where there's an oy, there's a vey.
Oh, I love that.
Any parting thoughts for us, gentlemen, as we wrap up here?
That was fun.
Yeah, I tweeted 20 minutes into it that this is, I think, one of my either one of or my favorite podcasts we've done, and it only got better from there. So, gentlemen, I'm going to spare you my Celtics rant for tonight because, God, I don't want to fucking talk about it.
My Lakers are about to clinch.
Yep, congratulations, Colborne. Your fucking Lakers are looking great.
I was ready to talk about it.
Do you want to talk about it, Kirk? You got basketball hot takes?
I'm just happy my Sixers swept the Nets. That's all.
Oh, fuck you guys and your Sixers and your fucking Lakers. Boy, I can't wait to have you back in this podcast after the Celtics beat the Sixers, and that's just going to be the topic. It's just going to be, let's fucking yell at Kirk.
Oh, boy.
And Colborne, we'll see if AD can stay healthy for more games.
Seriously, I know, exactly.
Anyways, everybody, thank you so much for being with us today. This was a long podcast, but boy, was it fun to be a part of it. I hope it was as much fun to listen to it. So we will be back here next week. Same bad time, same bad channel. Colborne, Untitled. Thank you both very much for being here. See everybody next week. Bye-bye.
Bye now.